Brian Summt came up to me and said he had someone really terrific. So I'm going to introduce 11-time member of the PGA, the web.com tour, Brian Summt.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Brian Summt, assistant golf professional at Coronado Golf Course. We're here today to talk to you about the mental side of the game. So, I've been the student. I have taken countless lessons, trust me, and I've spent an ungodly amount of money on golf instruction. I've been the player. I played professionally for 18 years, 11 of those on the web.com tour. 5 second place finishes, and my top world ranking was 250th in the world. That's even better than Tiger Woods now. Not bad for an apprentice. Now I'm a golf coach. I teach full-time at Coronado Golf Course. I teach players of all abilities. Beginners, juniors, ladies, even other professionals, college players. So I get to see a little bit of everything. Throughout my entire process of my golf education, I've had my ups and downs. And it wasn't until later in my golf career that I turned my focus more to the mental side of the game. By doing this, I was able to achieve a little better results on the golf course and getting more out of the hard work I was putting in off the golf course. Today I'm here to introduce Dr. Michael Lardon. He's not only a sports psychologist, he's also a doctor of psychiatry. He's written 3 books on peak performance, as well as he's coached some of the game's best players. I'm here to introduce Dr. Michael Lardon.
Well, good morning, everybody. Pleasure to be here. And I've known Brian for a long time. And oh, yeah. Get going. Testing. 1, 2.
1, 2, 1, 2.
Yes, sir.
Okay, you got me. So this is all off. Can you re-put this here?
Sure.
There you go. Okay. Can we go to the first slide?
We sure can.
So let me tell you a little bit about myself. I've been involved in professional sports for about 25 years. And through that time, I've worked and still do with the NFL, Major League Baseball, a variety of the Olympic teams, even the UFC. But my passion and really the majority of my work has been on the PGA Tour. I'm a professor at UCSD, and really in my residency, my fellowship, I studied peak performance, and it really all stemmed from my personal experience. So we're going to start with my personal experience, and we're going to start with a rather obscure sport. Let's see. All right, here we go. Okay, there you go. And that is ping pong, table tennis. Now, who would think table tennis here at the Golf Summit for you guys? But table tennis is in fact the 2nd largest sport in the world in terms of participation. At the Olympics in China, it was watched more than the finals of table tennis, more than the soccer finals. It is considered the fastest racket sport in the world, where the ball moves 100 miles an hour on a 9-foot table, and that's 140 feet per second. Those of you that think of ping pong in your basement, well, I'm going to show a little clip of world-class table tennis.
係要掌握嘅時間等等都要好好，所以佢頭先係失咗。咁但係相反，現時歐洲嘅運動員咧，比賽都用呢板啦，放下突然間削一板咧，令到你難以亦都應付嘅。但呢板靚啊，再一板發力，好衝㗎，陳生話夠埋一個車身，再一個包油，再夠埋㗎，再放工，重量點啲，佢剛才呢板咧，再呢板。
There you go. So, In 1976, I was in the finals of the United States Junior Championship in Caesars Palace, Las Vegas. I had just come home from Japan training with a world champion, and I had done some meditation before the match. And when I was in the match, some really strange things happened. The ball actually slowed down. So I was playing an individual, was very good, and that ball that you can see is moving very fast, was as big as a grapefruit, and I could kind of do anything I wanted with it. And that particular experience of mine, I found absolutely fascinating, and it really guided the rest of my life. So I became fascinated with this idea of the zone, or peak performance. The question is, what is the zone? We've all heard it, right? We've told, oh, he's in the zone, but what does that really mean? Is it a real phenomenon? Well, here's ESPN, many years ago, a young Dan Patrick talking about it.
But he fell out of this trance-like state during his final round with a 73. Amateur athletes are allowed entry on rare occasions, while the all-star athlete is a frequent visitor in the zone.
The basket's this big, and everything you throw up is going in. You know, like, it's your party, and everybody else is just invited.
Mullen wants it. It's one of those zones that you're in. Webster's dictionary doesn't offer a definition, but the common thread of this addictive state seems to be a marriage of body and mind, one that allows you to perform in slow motion on automatic pilot, with an inner peace elevating you to a higher level. The zone is a nice place to visit. Unfortunately, you don't decide when it's time to arrive or leave. One of the more recent guests of the zone was Michael Jordan in Game 1 of the NBA Finals. After knocking down 6 three-pointers, Jordan gestured that something had taken over his body.
I couldn't miss. I didn't know what was happening, but I was shooting. You know, it was just one of those things that, it was a zone.
When I have the look and I'm in the zone, I literally don't see anything. I think I've got not blinders, I think I'm in a tunnel.
You just feel above everybody else. And you gotta strut about yourself. You gotta feel about it. And everybody sees it.
Then just remember the words of Yogi Berra, who simplified its definition when he said, "How can I hit and think at the same time?"
So in the early 90s, I became fascinated really with this phenomenon. And I wrote a grant at UCSD. We won an award from the United States Tennis Association. And I spent over the next several years at the Salk Institute and Scripps Research Institute testing the brain waves of elite athletes. And we had everyone from Eric Heiden to John McEnroe to some of the very best athletes in the world. And we found some very interesting differences in terms of how they process very fast stimuli. And without taking you through all that, we published several papers in neuroscience journals. But that really, that science, how do you take that science and how do you apply it to playing sports and really enriching your game? And that brings us to what the golf mind. So in I think it's 91, my younger brother, he got a Ben Hogan card, if you can go back that far. He played 5 years on the PGA Tour. And this year he's 50 years old and he'll be in the finals of the Senior Q School in a month out in Scottsdale. And I got the call one day and he's, "Hey bro, I'm gonna play professional golf." And that's really how I got involved in golf. And I started caddying for him. And really one of the funny stories that's chronicled in John Feinstein's A Good Walk Spoiled book is I caddied for him. I guess we were out here in the desert. Long story short, we were playing with Gary Nicholas. So we had a big crowd following us because Jack was following us. So the crowd was following Jack, who was following us. We came to the 18th hole, and long story short, my brother had to two-putt from about 60 feet to get his tour card. And he left his putt short, and he had about an 8-foot slider with a little break. And I could see he was tremulous. And he said to me, "Hey bro, can you give me the read?" And I was thinking, for the last 6 days, he hasn't asked me for one read. I don't think he's ever asked me for a read. Now he's asking me for this read. I better pretend I know what I'm doing. So I gave him my best read, which wasn't a good one. He hit it too hard, didn't break, hit the back of the cup, went straight up, and went in. So he got his tour card, and back then, the caddies, we were pretty much exiled to the parking lot. And I hadn't shaved in a few days and looked pretty scrubby like most of the caddies. And I was out there, and John Feinstein was coming around interviewing us. And he came up to me and said, you know, how long you been caddying for Brad? And then he asked me, you know, why do they call you Doc? And then I mentioned that I went to medical school, and he had a hard time believing that. But that's kind of how it all started, way back in the very early 90s. So the question is, why does your head get in the way of your golf game? The idea is the better you are at sports, the more mental it becomes. You practice your swing, but how do you strengthen your mental game on the course? We all talk about mental toughness, but really, what is that? And how do we implement that in the athlete or the golfer? So most of the material today is from a new book I wrote. Phil Mickelson wrote the foreword. I had the pleasure to work with him for several years, and that was a lot of fun. And we're going to sell the new book out there with a 25% discount for y'all, if you're interested. Now, this really is the framework, and I don't know if you can hear me, but the book is in two parts. So, general attitude that great athletes have. We're going to talk about that, not all of it, but some of it. And then we're really going to talk about what you do on the golf course. So I wrote a book in 08, it was more anecdotal like Rotella books. But this one, I really wanted to write a workbook. And there are actual assignments in the book, and it's really the stuff that I do with the players. So I was hopeful, the players I couldn't work with, you know, I want you all to have access to the things that we do. So going here, in kind of the fundamental framework, we talk about attitude, motivation, that's thought control, emotional optimization, concentration, and then planning to get ready. And that's what we're going to focus on. So let's go to attitude. Attitude. You can choose your mindset. So what does that mean? Well, Shigeo Ito, he helped train me. He was a world champion in table tennis, and he used to tell us this: losing by missing your own shot at match point is acceptable. Losing by allowing your opponent to hit the winning shot before your own attempt is not. The one man or woman will come to recognize his or her strengths and weaknesses, and the other simply loses in ignorance. And what is that attitude? That's a go-for-it attitude. I always tell the golfers, you know, they're right behind you, so you need another birdie. You can't sit back. You know, prevent defense in the NFL. I always say that just prevents you from winning. So you got to go get it. The great players, they make the shot. They might not always make the shot. You think of Tom Watson at 59.5, and he almost won the British Open. They asked him in an interview, how'd you become such a great champion? And he said, because he first learned to lose and accept that, and with doing that, he could win. So instead of putting that huge price tag on winning, he really became, he wasn't fearful of losing, and he could let himself play. So when we think of your mindset, this research comes from Carol Dweck, who is a professor at Stanford, who's written a famous book called Mindset. And she studied athletes, politicians, business people for some 25 years. And what she finds is people on two ends of a continuum. So a growth mindset is when challenges are seen as opportunities in learning experience, and a fixed mindset and when challenges are seen difficult obstacles, and you dread failure. Now, here's the idea. We're all somewhere on this continuum, and in this book, and when I teach, I assess things like attitude, motivation. So we give examples, and we have you assess where you are. Some athletes, most of the very good ones, really live in that growth mindset. But a lot of people have that negative mindset, that fixed mindset. And if you become aware of this, you can move yourself to a growth mindset. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to take a couple of anecdotes from the book that are from real PGA Tour players, and I'm going to have you guys tell me the answer. So let me read this. And this particular player, he had won a major championship. I've worked with him many years. The younger players just hit the ball further and further. I can't keep up with them. So is this a growth mindset or a fixed mindset? Growth, raise your hand. Fixed, raise your hand. There you go. It's a fixed mindset. Let's try this one. It's been so long, I'd like to win this week, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. I know what I have to do. Stay patient, be committed to each shot, and make good decisions. Now, is that a growth mindset or a fixed mindset?
Growth.
That's a growth mindset. There you go. Let me get some water here. So, in the book, there's a test where you can learn where you are. They're practical examples, and they're exercises. So you can move yourself and you can assess your students. Because if you have a fixed mindset, you're going to have a hard time becoming an elite athlete or an elite golfer. Now, let's talk about goals. Everybody has a goal. They want to win a major, win a tournament, make a birdie, win some money. But how do you do that? Well, there are two broad concepts with goals, and one is a result goal. So a result goal is, let's make the putt. But how do you make the putt? What is the process behind making the putt? Well, you need the correct line and speed. You need to make a better stroke. You need to execute that stroke. And those are the components that lead to the result. So I like this slide because what you have to understand, it's the horse that pulls the cart, not the cart that pulls the horse. So if you say, yeah, I need to make a birdie on this hole, well, that's a lot more difficult than I need to make 3 really good shots. How do I make this shot? In golf, we say there's only one shot, the next shot. And what does that process ensue? So we only have so much mental energy, and we can allocate it, and we want to allocate that concentration, that mental energy, to the variables that influence how well you hit each shot. If you're worrying about making birdies or shooting 66, that's going to create a problem. That'll create more pressure for you. This is one of my clients, and maybe you'll all remember this. It's from out here in the desert when he shot 59. So David had the uncanny ability when he was in the zone, he could stay there for a while. After he shot 59, the journalists came and they interviewed him. And I remember it distinctly, and one of the journalists said, well, you know, you shot 59. It's not like Al Geiberger because there was no rough out here in the desert. And Double D's response was, when you shoot 59, you don't hit in a lot of rough. Thought it was a good one. When David was playing his best, he said, I never played to be #1 in the world. I've always done it to see how good I can be, how much I could master the act of hitting a golf ball. How Tiger played or plays has nothing to do with me pursuing that. Is that result-oriented or process-oriented? Yeah, see, he's about mastering control of the ball, and that's really what this game is about, controlling that little white ball. So the idea is to stay in the process and not focus on the results. That's easier said than done, and we're going to talk about how to do that. But let's go to motivation real quick, because motivation and confidence go hand in hand. When you play well and you've had a good round, you want to play the next day. Right? When we're playing well, that drives us to play. And the converse, of course, is true. When we think of motivation, we use two broad concepts. That's intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So intrinsic, when you're young and you fell in love with golf, you fell in love with it because it was fun. And later what happens is you teach for a living, you play on tour for a living, and it's easy to get burnt out. It's easy to see where you are on the money list, and you play for sponsors, and all of a sudden golf becomes a job, and it's not so much fun. So that's called extrinsic motivation. And a way to think about it is, I like to use the metaphor of gasoline. So intrinsic is high test, 90, whatever it is, 93% octane. Where extrinsic is a lower octane, sometimes we don't have a choice because you're 6 weeks out there on tour, you're burnt out, but you need to play that next week, and we take whatever we can get. But often, the golfers come to me because they're not doing as well. They're in a little bit of a slump, their motivation is down, and one of the things we do is we really revisit their youth. What was it like when you were young? Tell me when you play those, silly golf games, and we sort of try to reconnect them to having fun with golf. And sometimes that means putting the clubs in the bag, or when you play, being creative. And that piece is, I can't really emphasize how important that is. If you don't love it, you really don't play well. Confidence. Now, there's a science to confidence. The fancy term is called self-efficacy. It comes from a famous doctor called Albert Bandura, who also was at Stanford, and I wrote my thesis with him. But basically, confidence works like this. The strongest determinant of confidence is what we call mastery experiences. So I think of Rich Beam, another player I've worked with for a very long time. He won in Colorado, I think his third year on tour, and he got all pumped up, and the next week he won the PGA. Now, he came to that tournament, his confidence super high. He had just won his second tour event. That's really going to help him. And that's an example of mastery. An example of vicarious learning is another Rich Beam example. He first tried to get a tour card, went to Q school, didn't make it, went back to teaching, and then his friend J.P. Hayes, who he played college golf with, won a tour event, and Beamer, he thought, well, if JP can win, I can play as good as that guy. I'm going to go out there and do it again. And he went out to Q school, he got through, and he won that year in DC. So if you want to build someone's confidence, you talk about their mastery experiences. You talk about, hey, who's out there that you can play with? Modeling is another thing. When Tiger came into the game, when I first was caddying for my brother on tour, that was really the era of Craig Stadler, and I remember him eating a chocolate eclair at the turn, and then when Tiger came on, we had the physical therapy vans, and we looked like linebackers in the NFL, and people, they wanted to model his game and what he did. So if you do that, you feel more confident. Hey, I'm doing all these things. And then the last thing is social persuasion. So if you hang out with a lot of people that are negative, hey, I can't do that, how can I, compete on tour? And many of you know the line is super thin, super fine. I can remember one time with Phil, him telling me about Brian and what wonderful distance control Brian had. Now, Brian was on the web.com for many years, an excellent player. Mickelson is a Hall of Famer, but really the line is thin. At the highest level, there are not that many shots that separate the Lardon Trophy from the average tour player. So if you hang out with people that are positive, that you're in that kind of environment, all these things build confidence. So if we have a player that doesn't have a lot of confidence, we look at these variables, we emphasize them. We always say that we want to have really a short-term memory, an amnestic memory. You hit a bad shot, we forget about it. Hit a good shot, you give a little fist pump because we want to ingrain that in our neural network. And that's the beauty. We can pick and choose what we pay attention to. Despite your emotions, you can choose where you direct your thoughts. So we cannot choose the emotion, but we can choose where we think, and that's called free will. Free will is vital. It's important. It's what separates human beings from many of, or if not all, the other living species on Earth. Here's an example of what we call a positive and a negative thought cycle. Let's start with the positive. There are days when you're out there, I'm driving the ball well. That's what you're thinking. I'm seeing all my putts fall. Well, that makes you feel good. You're having fun. It's fun to make all your putts. And that cycle, when you're in it, we want you to stay there. However, that's not always the case. You can be out there, and it can be one of those days where your touch doesn't feel that good. The hazards, oh boy, that bunker's big, that water's big. And then that makes you feel anxious and frustrated. So what do? Well, it's not so easy to just change being anxious or frustrated, but you can change the thought. And if you change the thought, you can put a positive thought, and we're going to talk about what those are, and you'll start to feel better. So Billy Casper, who died recently, I knew him quite well. I was a member of San Diego Country Club for 10 or 15 years, and he would tell wonderful stories. And I'd asked him, I'd sit with him at lunch, you know, what do you do under pressure? What did you think about? Did you ever have any bad thoughts, Billy? And he said, I just think of one really simple thing, non-technical thought. He'd say, finish high. And I thought about that, you know, finish high for a great player is really not something it's not, you know, laying off at top. It's not some technical thought. It comes real natural. So what's the utility of thinking finish high? Well, the utility is that if you're coming down 18 and you're seeing all the water, PGA West, you don't want to say don't hit it in the water, right? Because that's called the ironic paradox, and of course you will. But if you just say, let's finish high, or let's pick that target. Let's allocate our attention to something that takes us away from a negative thought. So it's really not so much of having the perfect thought, it's just not having the negative bad thoughts. So you can substitute a really benign thought like finish high, or you can use that as really an anchor thought, meaning that's what I think about when I need to think about something. When you're in the zone, you don't think about much at all. And when people are playing well, not thinking about anything, we just let them go. Let's talk about fear and anxiety. So when you see this picture, what do you feel? Fear or anxiety? Fear, right? You feel fear. Now the truth is that's a dolphin, not a shark. So if you knew it was a dolphin, you might be a little anxious, but not so much fear, right? Now with this, I gotta just tell a quick funny story. So I had a UFC, Ultimate Fighters, you know, the guys in the cage, came to see me last year, and this particular fighter was having panic attacks, and to describe it, I always give an example of a panic attack. And he was an intimidating figure in my office. You know, he had some gangbanger friends, and he had a clothing label, and the pants were hanging way down. And his head was shaved. I mean, he was an intimidating guy. And I'm sitting there, and I said, well, panic attacks are like if you're camping with your girlfriend or wife, and all of a sudden you hear some wrestling around outside your tent, and you realize that there's a bear, you're going to have a panic attack. Your heart rate's going to go real high, your emotion is fear, and you're going to worry. And I said, that's an example. And he kind of looked at me quizzically and he said, brown bear or grizzly? And I said, did it make a difference? And he said, yeah, he thought the brown bear maybe he could handle, but not the grizzly. So then we went to that shark metaphor, and that's where I got the slide. So now I always use the shark. So I'm waiting for the guy to tell me he could handle the shark. But here's the point. You have to differentiate fear and anxiety. Fear is biologically programmed in us, right? It's an evolutionary adaptive response. in primitive times, right? Saber-toothed tiger comes, you want to have fear because it's a flight or fight response. You need to get out of there to save your life. Because fear is emotional distress caused by the anticipation of danger. That's how we have fear. And ironically, we have fear in sport and in golf, right? It's a really tight hole. No bailout left or right. But here's the question. Is golf dangerous? No, golf isn't dangerous. The worst thing, double bogey, go home, don't make the cut, your kids still love you, right? But what happens is biologic evolution lags behind society. So we play these games that are fun, and we experience this emotion that is evolutionary programmed, and it's really too much. We don't have to be fearful. So I'll have somebody before an event, and they'll be in fear. And the first thing we do is we differentiate. We say, that's not really fear. Are you afraid you're going to die out there? Well, no, I'm not really afraid. Okay. So if you're not afraid, it's not fear, so what is it? It's anxiety. And there's nobody, Tiger Woods, US Open, nervous off the first tee. So if anybody tells you they're not nervous, teeing off, you know, in a big event, they're not telling the truth. That's normal. And what we do is we tell athletes to have permission. Of course you're a little anxious. We teach them it's a good thing. Your cortisol levels are up, your epinephrine, you're more focused, you hit the ball a little harder. And here's a curve from my first book, Finding Your Zone. And if you have no anxiety, you're flat, right? You don't have any inspiration. So that's not optimal. So you want some mild anxiety. You want to, you know, be up for it. And that's where we find people getting in the zone. But if you have too much anxiety, over here, you can have panic attacks and you can't play. But anxiety feeds off itself. So if you let people know, hey, a little bit of anxiety is fine, we want it, suddenly they embrace the anxiety, and there's a word, effervescent, like bubbles, defervescent. Their anxiety goes down just by giving them some permission and telling them it's a good thing, not a bad thing. But that doesn't always work. There are people that have panic attacks, and they really have tremendous autonomic arousal. And short of medicines, we have other non-pharmacologic ways to help them. And the good thing, the simple thing, is breathing. Now, we've all heard about breathing. Well, how does that really work? This next slide might look complicated, but I'm going to make it easy. So you have in your autonomic nervous system, and you can think of automatic nervous system, you have two halves. You have the flight or fight response. That's called the sympathetic response. Your pupils dilate, they get bigger, your heart rate goes up, and you're all up. The other half of the nervous system is called the parasympathetic, and that's when you relax. That's when you're eating a really good meal. That's how you feel after, you know, you make love, and it's that blissful time. Well, when you breathe, when I breathe, let's see. No, we'll do it like this. When I breathe, if I breathe fast like a dog, what happens is I don't exchange air. The air is in my trachea, and there's no alveoli, and those are the little cells that exchange air. So what happens, my carbon dioxide level gets up, and I even become more panicky. But if I breathe slow, and I always think of the old Pillsbury Dull Boy commercial, and you can't be vain, but if you make your tummy soft, and when you breathe in, your tummy comes out, you engage your vagus nerve. That nerve slows your heart down, slows your pulse down, decreases your blood pressure. So we teach people yogic breathing. You might not say it's yogic breathing. Now, you know, there are all these Zen masters that go to ashrams and learn this. In today's day and age, we have these great devices on the internet or your iPhone that can measure a thing called heart rate variability, and I use it with a place kicker in the NFL, and he just holds his handheld device, and when he's having yogic breathing, it's green, and we know we're ready. There's a company, Heart Math. I talk about it in my book. We teach regular people that. It's very fancy biofeedback. And it's a very, very powerful tool. And if you have an athlete that has that problem, they all may not, but if they have that, we certainly teach them that tool. Okay, concentration. What does that mean? Concentration. Oh, you got to concentrate hard. You got to concentrate like a laser. Well, let's try to understand what that really means. Mental energy of concentration. This Jack Nicklaus, he would say this. He would say, I pulse my concentration like an accordion. In Golf My Way, he talks about this. And I think a way to think about it is studying. So they do all these studies on learning. 5 hours. If you all have to sit in this room for 5 hours and grind away, that's not optimal. You'll get tired. Your retention is best in the beginning, best at the end, falls off in the middle. So if you want to optimize your studying, you probably study for 50 minutes, you take a 10-minute walk, you come back, you keep your intensity up, you pulse it. In golf, you don't have 50 minutes and take 10 off, but you do have this rhythm of the game. So the idea is, after you hit the ball, you release, right? You relax, okay? Then when you come to the ball, that you see it, you start to think, okay, what's the distance, what's the shot? And this process of concentration, relaxation is really critical. And when we see guys that, if we look at the stats, and stats can be very helpful, and if there's a decrement in performance at the end of the round, often they're getting mentally tired or physically. Sometimes they're in great shape, and it's really they're getting mentally tired. And what they do is they grind the whole way. There are a few golfers, Tiger could do that, but most don't. Now, another way to think of mental energy or concentration is where you turn your attention. In golf, when you're working with your teacher and he says to you or she says to you, hey, you're laid off on the top, you try to feel your hands, yeah? And you're turning your attention internally. That's internal attention towards your body. Now, if you're visualizing shots, and I talk more about visualization in the book, but if you're visualizing, it's an external attention, right? Let me see the shape of the shot out there versus the feeling in here. So attention can be internal, it can be external. Attention can be broad or narrow. So let's think of basketball. You're coming down the court. You know, you're going to pass the ball. You're a guard. You want to have very broad focus, right? You want to see who's open, who's not open. Magic Johnson, you know, he could pass to the guy and, you know, it was just beautiful, right? So that's very different than when you shoot a foul shot, right? A foul shot, you don't want to be looking at all those people screaming behind the basket. You need to have very pinpoint, very narrow attentional focus. So the same player, depending on the needs, changes the focus. So in golf, this is kind of an optimal golf focus diagram. And how it works is something like this. So when you're actually executing the shot, you have a narrow focus. There you are at the ball, okay? Now, when you're competing, or let's go here, when you're training with your coach and you're thinking about what you're doing technically with your elbow, your hands, you know, obviously you need good technique, the focus is internal. But when you're competing, the last thing you want to be doing is thinking about where's my club head right now. You know, when you're at the dance, you just got to make the best of it. So when it's a tournament, the focus really needs to be over here, which is external. Let me see the shot. What's going on out there? That's not a time to be thinking about, you know, where's the placement of my body, the kinesthetic placement. Between shots, here's the idea of broad. You execute the shot. You know, Freddie Couples talks about feeling the ground when he walks. When I was in that tournament in table tennis a long time ago, Pancho Gonzalez helped me. He's a famous tennis player. And before the match, he helped me really look at the furthest object and really still my mind. And so between the matches, between the points, I would do that to relax. So when we focus, we have to pay attention to where our attention is. And you'd be amazed how many people don't and how important it really is. Now the great players, they do this innately. And you probably, much of it you do innately, but it's that little piece that you don't that makes the difference. So here's an example. When you train and experiment with technique, you're working on your swing, you use a video, you play creative games. There's a training mindset. But when you are in the event, the tournament, it's not really a time to think about technique. That's the time to think about strategy. You know, if you're hitting a cut that day, maybe we have to hit a cut that day. Work at it at the range when you're done, okay? But in the heat of battle, you take who you brought to the dance. So that's trust. So we have a trust mindset when we compete and a training mindset. And people will say, you know, I'm hitting it so good at the range, and I get on the course and I can't play at all. But it's a different demand, it's a different game. And it's very important. I don't think your average golfer, you know, differentiates these two things. They run down to the range, hit as many as they can, you know, walk off the first tee. So, you know, the average golfer, if you can really teach them this concept a little bit, it doesn't have to be so technical, it'll really make an impact. Okay, during competition. So when Mickelson hires me, he hires me for one thing. That's to win. That's what he hires me, okay? And when I start talking to him about process, he starts smiling and he kids me, okay? Because he's heard all that stuff. And human nature is, hey, I want to win. So that process stuff sounds good, but how do we do it? How do we get the golfer to stay process-oriented and not focus on results? Well, that's really a challenge because we're biologically strung. The survival thing is to win, okay? We always like to evaluate ourselves. It's human nature. It's not human nature to just be in the process and forget about, you know, I'm on the bubble to make the cut or I'm right at the precipice of winning, but it's not helpful. So we play a little trick. And we're gonna make a little sidetrack and do a little basic neuroscience, okay? Left brain, right brain, no brain. That's as much as we get. So your left brain, analytic, logical thought. I think you got some of this yesterday, people were telling me. And that's where, you know, we think about, we calculate, we strategize. The right brain, that is creativity, creative thought. And if you think of Jason Day, I mean, I love this Jason Day, okay? He's such an example of making sure his right brain is in the shot. He's seeing it. And the creative, the feeling side doesn't always have to be visualization. It could be kinesthetic. So when Duval's playing well and he was hitting the cut and he hit everything, great driver of the ball, he would just feel the sense of holding on. So it could be feeling, it can be seeing. There was some time we were on the range next to VJ, and for tempo, he was saying, Cindy Crawford, okay? So it can be sound, it can be whatever it is that puts you in that mindset. And an interesting thing that I've noticed on tour is, I can be with a great player, he has a generic 9-iron, 150 yards, he somehow doesn't concentrate, hits it over the back, makes double. But you give that same player a very tough shot through the trees, you know, some wild shot, and that same player makes a great shot. What's the difference between those two shots? Well, that difficult shot, it implores him or her to really see it, to put that creative piece in, which is essential to great shots. Sometimes on the easy shot, it's easy to no-brain it and make a really critical mistake. Golf is like surgery in many ways. If you make a mistake, you got to clean up your mess, right? And it's about it being exact and being consistent over 5 hours, which is simple, but it's not easy to do. So here's a question for you all. Do you want to use your logical brain? Do you want to use your right brain, your creative brain? Or do you want to use no brain when you play? Okay, for logical brain, do we have hands? Do you use your logical brain? I mean, you got to strategize, you got to know 165 yards, I'm going to take it over, you know, over the left. But how about your right brain? We just talked about Jason Day. So do you use your right brain? Hopefully. And I think with the best players, that's something that players don't do. That's probably the most important. And then what about no brain? Do you ever get up there and no brain it? Okay. So really we use all parts. All three. That's the answer. Now, here's an example before we get going. This is Tiger's famous chip-in. So I'm about halfway into this little clip, and he's already strategized it. He's already walked up. He sees how it's going to break. And now he's feeling it. Now he's seeing exactly where that ball, okay, is going to take that turn. Can we show the clip? That's right brain.
There's a good chance he doesn't get this inside the Montrose ball.
Yeah, we chose that clip because Nike's a sponsor here. I'm kidding. I did this talk for the Southern Texas PGA, and TaylorMade was the sponsor. They didn't like the Nike logo there. I was going to sub in a TaylorMade ball. Okay, so that takes us really to, you know, what do you teach these guys on the golf course? Okay, because they read the motivation, thought control, all that, and they're like, hey doc, you know, I'm out here. What am I going to do? Okay, so here's the paradigm that I use. Oh, and it's not something I made up. It's really something I've seen in all sports. And I see it very consistently at the highest level of all sports. So let's use this very simple concept, and this is pre-shot pyramid. Now when I say pre-shot, I mean mental pre-shot, okay? And that's a new concept. If you say to a golfer, well, what's your mental pre-shot? They don't know what you're talking about, right? But let's go with it. So here's the mental pre-shot pyramid, and the first thing you do is you calculate the shot, right? 6 iron, what's your strategy? On tour, you have a caddy to help you with that, but you figure out what you're going to do. Then after that, you create the shot. You see the shot. You feel the shot. You have to get a sense of the shot. You know, you think of Seve Ballesteros, right? He would always, when he's chipping and putting, you know, it's always about making it. Phil at Torrey Pines a few years ago on 18, he had a hole in for eagle with a wedge to go in a playoff. And he walked up 100 yards, and there was a huge crowd, and he looked at the break of the green, and I thought it was, you know, it took some huevos to do that in front of that crowd from 100 yards. You know, most of us hit a shot. Even the great players, they hit a shot. They don't walk all the way 100 yards up to the green. Then he went back to hit the shot, and then he had Bones pull the flag. Pull the flag from 100 yards. Now, is he being arrogant? You'd say, oh yeah, except he's Phil, right? And that ball missed going in that cup by about 3 inches. Because he saw that shot, the intention, right? There's intention, there's creativity. One time I asked Ben Crenshaw, we were in Texas at the Austin Golf Club, and we were putting, my brother, I don't play with these guys, I just hang out with them. And I said, Ben, what do you think about when you putt? And it was an interesting answer. He said, well, I just imagine that the ball is tied to a string and it's pulled into the cup. And everybody smiled, you know, like only Ben Crenshaw could think like that. But it's a beautiful kind of thought, right? It creates this relationship between the cup and you, right? You connect it. It's a feeling thing. I mean, when Magic passes behind his back, does he really know the player's there? You know, you talk to many of the great athletes, and it sort of borders on a little paranormal. What was it? Ray Floyd, one of his caddies who I know, used to say that he really thought that he could will the ball in. And then I asked him, I said, well, could he? And he said, I think he could. I mean, sometimes. So you have to spend a little bit of time in your pre-shot, really connecting to what you're doing. Just can't come up and hit it, okay? You do that, it's not gonna happen. Then, okay, you got a feel for the shot, you figured out the shot, what do? Well, no mind, okay? The optimal thing is just step in and hit it, okay? I love Dave Stockton's putting because it's the same. You know, you get a feeling, you know, he does a thing when you go visit him, he's got a book, you sign your name. You sign your name when you come in, and then he asks you, you know, how do you sign your name? And then when you do that, your signature looks terrible. We want to be natural. We want to bypass our cortex. We want to trust our biology. And the studies that we did in the early 90s really showed that, you know, when you're performing well, you're not thinking about it. When we make you think about things, you get in trouble. Like, I've worked with, I mean, maybe we could do this in question answer, but guys who have the yips, well, what do? We have their attention. Joel Kreibel, one time at Torrey, he had the yips, and I took him to San Diego Country Club. We practiced chipping on one foot, so he had to think about his balance, and all of a sudden he released his club head, his touch came back, and then he said, well, what do you think of me chipping on one foot in the event? I said maybe 2 feet. But okay, I get him to think about something else, and I release this piece. So the game we play with the golfer, we know that the athlete is going to evaluate himself no matter how we cut it. I can tell him all day long, be process-oriented, but you know, that's not the way they are. So we tell him this, every shot you hit, if you calculated the shot, okay, if you felt it, you created it, and you stepped in and you hit it, you get a credit. That's a credit. I don't care if it goes out of bounds. That's 1 for 1. Conversely, you might hit it in from the fairway for eagle, but you no-brained it. That's 0 for 1. So now we've asked you to rate, right? Rate each shot. When Phil won the British Open, only 2 shots in 4 days was he not totally engaged. So his mental scorecard, and I'll show you in a minute, was 98%. Okay, every shot, he goes through this protocol. Well, one of the problems is, on tour you have a caddy. So we tell the caddies, don't hand the player the club until the player's ready, okay? And the caddies will say, you know, see the shot, get a good picture, what have you. So they have the luxury of having a coach right there in the moment. Well, not all of us do, who play regular golf. I'm not a huge product guy, but I like this product called Game Golf. Michelle McGann, I used to work with her. She went on the LPGA 8 times, and we had a thing, she would touch her shoulder, just touch this shoulder, and that was a signal for her to engage and see the shot. That was a little kind of thing we did, and it reminded her to be consistent, because it's easy to do it for a bunch and then forget it, right? So we have a little trigger. In Game Golf, this is an interesting little device because it's like the John Brody, every shot counts. It teaches you some very valuable information, some stats, but I like it because you touch your belt with the back of the club, that signals, the GPS will track every shot you make. But what we do is we do that right here. So you figure out your shot, but right before you get that image to remind yourself, touch your belt. It's like Michelle McGann touching her shoulder. Let's get the image, okay, then let's proceed with the pre-shot. And then you get some interesting data. So anyhow, I like that product a lot. For $200, people can learn a lot about their game, especially the college players. And it works well in helping them train to do the pre-shot pyramid if you don't have a caddy all the time. So here's how the mental scorecard works. We did the pre-shot pyramid. You need those 3 criteria to get a point. So we have this scorecard. It's modified. You have a real score, R. Then you have the number of shots that qualify. Then you have a fraction. So for example, on hole number 1, you made a bogey. You made a 5. Of those 5 shots, 4 of them you can go back and say, yeah, I did my process. Okay, got a good... got good information, made a good strategic decision, okay? I sort of really felt the shot, I stepped in, I executed with full commitment. But 1 shot you didn't, so it's a 4 out of 5. The next hole, you make par, and you do that on all 4 shots, that's a 4 out of 4. So if you follow me, there's your bogey, okay? Second hole, you made a par, and you were 4 for 4. The next hole, you make a par, okay? And again, we're 4 for 4, but on the 4th hole, okay, you make a par, but only one shot qualified, okay? Only one shot you went through your process. And what you find that in this example, your mental scorecard is 13 over 17, so that's 76%. Now what's that mean? Well, we're going to show what levels of golf and how they do it. But what we've done is we've tricked you. We resolved the dilemma because you want to rate yourself, and people get competitive. I had this guy, Scott Fawcett, I worked with him. He's from Dallas. He called me years ago. He had made some money in the energy business. He was 35. He was a great amateur player when he was young. Then he wanted to come back and play. He was not even the club champion, and he was one of these stats people. So he took this concept and he sent me all these spreadsheets. He worked with me for a year. He won his club championship. He did well in the U.S. Amateur. Next thing you know, he was on the web.com and almost got a big tour card. And we watched him, 75%, 80%, and he was so competitive. I'm doing the mental scorecard, and the mental scorecard has a very high correlation with real score. In theory, I'll say to somebody, okay, now, we tested you today, you were 80%, right? What do you think you could do? What do you think you could do for me? And the golfer will say, oh, 90%, 95% maybe, being cavalier. And I say to them, well, let's say your kid's life depended on it. Do you think you could go out there and just do this simple thing 3 times, okay? Strategy, get a picture, and hit it. Do you think you could do it if your kid's life depended on it? Everybody says yes. So now the bar is 100%. You can do it. Of course you can do it. You're in control of it. So you build confidence because, you know, your confidence wavers if you get a bad bounce, it goes out of bounds. All the things that happen in golf, they happen in life, right? We say we make plans and life happens, right? We make plans and golf happens, okay? But if you rate yourself on this process, you can always say, yeah, I can do this piece. You can do it, and you can feel good. Even if you get a bad break, it hits the green, it's a hard spot, it jumps over the back, you make double. You can look at it a different way. You can say, okay, that's the score, but I'm doing well this way, and ultimately it'll work out. I remember we played with Tommy Armour one year out here in the Q School finals, and on the first hole he made an 8, snowman. Not too many guys in tour school start with a snowman. Armour, he just fought away. They used to cut after 4 days, and they had 2 last days. Anyhow, he got the card at the end of it, and I talked with him, and he said, you know, I didn't panic. I stayed in my process. I've been playing golf my whole life. And he didn't focus, he didn't get nervous, he just stayed with it and he made it. So we've done some anecdotal studies. The 20 handicapper, less than 50% of the time they do this, okay? They're just out there playing. Maybe a few shots they do it, but certainly less. Single digit players, 50 to 75. I don't know, I'm a 3-4 handicap and I'm probably like 50%, you know. Tour golfer, 90%. Brian's in the 90s. I had the pleasure of working with Brian for a few years. The elite tour players, when they're playing really well, they're up close to 100%. And the correlation is like 0.9. So if you have a good mental scorecard, maybe one day, you know, the score might be 76, but ultimately, okay, those scores are going to be very good. That's something you have in control. It's something you can do. It is a game plan or a mental game plan for on the course. It's a script to follow. So here we go in summary. So the book, the first part of the book really talks about these more broad concepts. Attitude, motivation, how do we deal with emotion, how do we deal with thought, concentration, some of the concepts, some stuff about visualization I didn't have time to go into. And planning is, you know, how do you set goals, short-term, long-term, things like that, to optimize, to time it so you play well in the big events. And then the mental scorecard system that we just talked about is, you know, what do we do when we're out there? What do we concentrate on? How do we stay focused? So with that, it all comes from my book, my latest book. Phil wrote the foreword. It's on Amazon and all those places. And we have a bunch of them out there. And I thank you for your time. Brian and I are going to do some question answer as sports psychologist and tour teaching pro. with the last 20 minutes that we have. So thank you.
Okay, questions, you guys?
Turn that off.
Turn this off.
Yeah, I turned it off. You want to use that one?
Yeah.
Okay, everyone? Okay, so just really casual. I mean, anything in there raises any questions that maybe Brian and I can field.
Don't be shy.
Sir, in the back.
You got a question you're helping a student with a playing lesson, you're trying to get them to go through this process. You know, and they say they've done this, but only you yourself know as a player to follow this process, right? So it's better about making sure they're being truthful with it.
Well, I'll let Brian put his sense in it in a moment, but what I do is I go out to the course with the players on Tuesday before the event, or they come here to San Diego, and I will be in the cart with them. We'll play the hole. Right after the hole, I say, let's go through it. You know, I don't want to hear bogey. I know if it's a bogey or a birdie, but we talk about this. We drill them, and I'm out there with a whip. And then when they're out there playing on tour, I'll typically speak with them after an event, and we will go through it. Now, those are people that are highly motivated. They're playing for their living. When you have somebody that's playing more recreationally, what I say is, the quickest way to make improvement in your game is you fill out the scorecard. And on my website, we have downloads for hypnosis, visualization, and you can download that scorecard. It's in the book too. But we actually have them, fill it out, and I make everybody get a composition book. So I make it sort of a game for them to do in parallel. And that's kind of how I indoctrinate them.
And then just getting your students to be really honest about what they're doing, getting them to slow down, getting them to work through the process. A lot of times you'll see guys, they're in a big hurry, they get on the golf course, they're just used to doing what they've been doing all these years. People are creatures of habits, so it does take time. And
they say habits, 7 weeks. So if you can get somebody, that's why I like that game golf product, because it reminds them, there's 2 reasons. One for the card and one, hey, I want to see my stats. If you can get somebody to do something for 7 weeks, there's a pretty darn good chance you can keep them doing it.
Stay on them.
Other questions?
Wouldn't you say, I guess the mental practice, it depends where they are on their career? Meaning, for instance, like a pro, if they're starting their preseason and they decide to make a swing change, their mental aspect is gradual. So the closer they get to competition, it changes the way they practice and stuff like that.
Well, clearly, closer to competition, you do change your practice, right? You focus on the things that really are more scoring related. But, your mental processes happen in parallel. So we want you to really practice your mental pre-shot. That doesn't really change what you're doing in your physical practice. But, we like this part to be really ingrained when the tournament comes. And one thing I was thinking, maybe Brian can comment on this, but if I'm teaching students, you're working on swing, you're not really working on the mental scorecard. But I might take, 10 minutes with the student. This is what I do with the players. I never comment on their technical aspect of their swing. Sometimes I work with the coaches a lot, and we'll take some time and we'll say, hey, let's not think about the technique. Let's think about what we're doing mentally before each shot. So I'll train that piece separate from the physical piece, and we really take a time out to do this because we know that this is really important when you're out there trying to score. But you do change your practice, but I think the mental scorecard piece is independent.
Yeah, and just adding to that, it's, when we're working with beginners or intermediate players, these people are working on technical things, getting them to improve, so those require a lot of repetitions. But then there comes a time when we have to transfer that onto the golf course, and then this is just a perfect way to kind of tie that in, get them to stick to a process, because what's going to happen is you're not going to be there all the time reassuring them. just a way for them to do it on their own, and just gives them a good way to follow up with themselves.
And with that, the more beginners they are, you don't want to laden them with all this. You want them to have fun. But as people get better, they become interested in scoring and how do we translate it, to the competitive environment. That I think this becomes more important. Sir.
Cognitively, about what age can you start? I work with some 4-year-old kids that are already in tournaments and on up.
Well, it reminds me of this. I mean, a few years ago, I had some parents bring in their son who had won, I guess, the World Junior Championship or some very large event, and he was young. He was like 10. And I asked the boy, I said, is there a problem? And he said no. Then I brought the parents in, and is there a problem? And, we want him to see the best sports psychologist, and I'm like, maybe y'all need to see me to lay off your kid. Let him have some fun here. So I remember I was once sent to see Michelle Wee a long time ago when she was young, and the last thing she wanted to do was see some 50-year-old shrink guy. So when they're young, I want them to have fun, and and a lot of them do it innately. So if they're doing it, I don't really point it out. It's like Rotella wrote a book with Brad Faxon, and Brad Faxon had to think about his putting, and that was the worst year putting he had on tour, was the year he wrote the book. So, we want you to have fun. We really get more into this when you need it, and then it's individual with kids. But, I want kids to have fun. I don't want them to think too much.
Yeah, I'd like to hear, actually, both of you guys talk about this. You were talking about your internal focus versus your external focus, and I'm talking about myself and my students. If I'm working on something in my swing, taking it to the course, most of the times I want to feel whatever I'm trying to feel in my swing for a practice swing. But if I heard you right, it sounded like you want to focus in on external, the hole or the shot, or so I mean, Brian, what do you do? When you're working on something, do you key in on a swing feel, or is it always the target? Or?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm a perfect person to answer that. Because I played, literally for the last 10, 12 years I played, I was just this far from the PGA Tour and just constantly trying to make changes and thinking I had to do something just a little bit better. Making all these changes and then not focusing on the right things on the golf course a lot of the times, just wasted time. So those things are great to work on. We want to bust our butt and work on our golf game.
Let me add in, it really is a good question. So the broad stroke is this. If it's something that is really natural, okay, we hold off to hit a cut, right? Good players, they don't have to think too much about that. So that I like that feeling. If it's something you're working with your coach that you want to feel your elbow tucked in or something you don't really have down pat, I don't like you to be thinking about too much of something that you don't have full command of when you're competing. So let me give you 2 examples, both with Phil. Phil was, I guess, the Scottish Open the year before he won it, and he called me and he was telling me he saw Butch and had like 25 swing thoughts. And I asked him about, is there some feeling that, unifies those things? And he sort of came up with something, I can't even remember, I think I wrote about it, but I said, let's put all those other things away. And it was something about extension. I said, tomorrow, why don't you just work on that sense of extension? And he did, and he played really well that week. So what we did is we created something for him that was easy for him. Here's a rule. If it needs to be easy and simple in sport. If it's complicated and you're really working on a certain field, let's keep that to the range or a playing lesson. So that's one piece. Another piece is putting. Before the U.S. Open, this last 2 times ago where he came in second, and then he had the good year, he was messing around with all these putters, tall, short, thick grip, different grips, and he was saying he was going to use one, use the, I don't know, the cross-handed for distance or what have you. And I just said, so when you putted your best, when was that? I think he said when he was young. He said, I used to make everything. I said, well, how'd you putt? He said, I used to just step up and knock it in. I said, could we just do that? And that was the end of it. And then he putted fantastic and won the British Open. So, you know, I like feel if it's accessible, okay? But if they're still working on it and we can only get it some of the time, I'd rather just, you know, finish high.
As far as what I was talking about is when I go out and play now, I think I play just as well, if not better, than I used to play. But I'm not focusing and practicing all these things. My game's good enough as it is. And when I go play now, sticking to my process, doing the things I'm in control of. But when I get over the ball, I can see the target in my mind's eye, and I really connect to the target, and then that frees me up. So all the practice and hard work goes into it to get to that point. And, you know, but I can really feel like I'm connected to the target, and that just allows my body to hit the shot.
And that's that right brain thing. Let me just highlight that, connect to the target, okay? There has to be this sense of seeing it, feeling it, connecting to it. It's real. So like, for example, I was working with a World Cup skier. When he'd go up on the chair, gate number 17, it was real fast. You know, gate number 12 was slow, slushy. That's left brain, right? Strategize. Then when they wait to go out the gate, he sees all the gates in his mind's eye, okay? When the light hits, boom, instinct. I work with this high jumper, Jamie Nieto, on the Olympic team. And two things. One is he made the Olympic team at like 36, but he texts me, hey Doc, thanks, I made the team, I won. He said, I won. So I went to the Google, I looked him up, and he came in second, so he didn't win. When I talked to him, he said, no, I won. I did everything we worked on. And in high jumping, there's wind, velocity, angle of attack, that's the strategy. Then his sense is they do this Fallsbury flop thing, jumps 7'6". I mean, it's pretty amazing. And it's to feel his belt rise above the bar, and then boom, he goes. So you see this in almost every non-continuous sport. Question, sir.
Obviously I ate too much, about 230 pounds. No, yeah, no, you have to be really mindful of that. I mean, I'm not in perfect shape, but I was actually really diligent about that. You'd be surprised the amount of people that don't take that into account, but no, really much.
Well, let me say that it's super important, and you got to be proactive, because what happens is, like, I think of Southern Hills PGA Championship. A bunch of my players were there, plus my little brother played in it, and it was so hot out in Tulsa, and by the time you realized you were dehydrated, it was too late. So, you know, you want to, I mean, and on tour, you know, make sure the caddy's all over that, but that's a big deal. Way back, in the back, yeah.
Yes. How do you deal with teaching juniors who, when they see the draw, who they're playing with, they develop this anxiety because, yeah, maybe if you don't get along with the player they're playing with, and suppose they go play with somebody they don't even know, play extremely well.
Yeah, I mean, I always, you know, well, let Brian answer first. I'll go second.
That's a great question. I mean, just getting them to be there for the love of the game. And then I see that a lot with like junior girls and like high school girls. They're all about this little, you know, business going on out there. But just getting them to be out there for themselves and why they're doing it, what their passion and their love for the game is. I mean, the rest of it is just nonsense. So just getting them to focus in on why they're there.
So I had a couple things. One, it reminds me of a story with Duval and Chris Riley from San Diego. So I think they were in the U.S. junior finals, semifinals, something like that. And Riley was famous for playing really fast. And he was intimidating to a lot of the other players because as soon as they hit, Riley hit. And Duval, I think we were all together, and Duval was telling the story, and he was saying back then, you know, his friends were saying, man, you got to play this guy, he hits it so fast, you get your rhythm off. And Duval, you know, he's kind of a deadpan kind of guy. He just thought about it, and he said, but he has to wait for me to hit, doesn't he? Right? So, you know, you're in control of your own thing, one. And then, you know, we teach them, you know, up front, I mean, who are you playing? You playing the course, you playing the player, you playing yourself? Because, you know, one thing I love about golf, tennis exemplifies this wonderfully. Nadal, Federer, Djokovic, I mean, they tip their hat they to each other. If the guy, you know, you play great, the guy shoots 59, tip your hat, right? I mean, so I like that gentleman or gentlewoman kind of approach to sport. You know, it's not war. Arnold Palmer at 2008 Bel Air Country Club, the media was asking him, you know, what made you this great player? What you learned from your dad? And he said, golf's a game. I'm going to go have some fun, you know? And he said, I played to have fun. Maybe I could have won more majors if I played like Jack, but he always kept that perspective. So I think it's really important that your kids keep that perspective. We call that comparative thought. Comparative thought is rarely good. It's almost always toxic. There's, you know, compare yourself to somebody else. There's not a lot of good that comes from that, unless it's positive, like the modeling or the vicarious learning example I gave with Rich Beam and J.P. Hayes.
I would think having some breathing techniques while committing to that process on the course would be important.
Definitely.
Then you were talking about earlier in your presentation about the breathing and you're fixing in on that process. Should just incorporating some breathing while in that moment?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, a lot of the good athletes do this. Most of them, I think, at a high level, you know, have learned this. But yeah, it's a very important tool. Let me say, like with Mickelson, you know, it's really not an issue. He has fun with it, and you know, he lives for the big moment. But that's, you know, my little brother who's kind of been on and off tour, you know, his name goes to the board, and you can see him breathing like this, and you know, Brad, hand on your belly. Let's keep it cool. So yeah, I mean, there's nobody that we don't go over that with.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Lardon, Brian, thank you guys for your insight.